My name is Tommy Sheppard, and between 2015 and last month, 2024, I was the Member of Parliament for Edinburgh East. And in that role, did many things in Parliament, but I spoke on behalf of my party, the SNP, on constitutional matters and was quite engaged in the debate about the monarchy. Yeah, well, it's pretty difficult to be a Republican in the UK Parliament. There's probably a few dozen closet Republicans, but very, very few people who put their head above the parapet, partly because there are very, very few opportunities to do so and procedures that allow you to question the relationship between the head of state and the government. But also when you do get the opportunity, there's just a whole attitude and culture that you must never criticize the monarch. The degree of deference and servility that's manifest in Parliament is remarkable, really. And it's just one of these issues where Parliament is so very out of tune with the common people and most of the population. I mean, you ask for experiences, like I say, in the chamber itself, in the parliamentary procedures, very, very few opportunities. But I can remember where we had to take a decision about changing the funding of the monarchy. And the government of the day, I think it was George Osborne was Chancellor, he wanted to rapidly increase the grant to the royal family on the pretext that they needed the money to do up Buckingham Palace. I argued against that. There was what's called a delegated legislation committee, a DL committee, to consider this statutory instrument that would give legislative effect to this change, and I was a sole voice arguing against it on the logical grounds that actually, if there's a problem with Buckingham Palace, then find the money to fix Buckingham Palace. It's a state asset. You don't need to give it to the royal family, and you certainly don't need to increase in perpetuity the level of funding to the royal family on the pretext of doing some capital works to a building. But I was the only, I wasn't even arguing from an anti-monarchy perspective or a Republican perspective. I was just saying this doesn't make sense in terms of the public finances and looking after taxpayers' money. There's been other occasions where I've seen people reprimanded by the Speaker for even trying to raise in the chamber matters relating to the royal family, in that it's not something you do. There's not a committee you can go to and say, I want to raise this and discuss the relationship, or there's nowhere you can ask for even a review. Parliament is just so unrepresentative of the population as a whole. So who knows what the new Parliament will bring? I'm not going to be there. On paper, there's a few more people in there who might be prepared to take an independent stance in this and a critical stance and try and raise some questions. But I wish them well, but I know from experience that the chances of doing this are slim, and they make it very, very difficult. So, which is why, as well as raising these things inside Parliament, I think it is so important that we build a campaign outside Parliament for constitutional review and just asking ourselves, is it not time to get rid of this silly sort of fairy tale arrangement? It's everywhere and nowhere. I mean, it's so pervasive and so unchallenged that it just becomes part of the everyday. And even if people who don't agree with the monarchy will talk about things about has it had royal assent yet, or whatever, or the King's speech, or there are. It's so ingrained in our procedures, the institution, that it's you sort of have to, if you're there and you're trying to work those procedures and you're trying to be a parliamentarian, you're obliged to go along with it. So it's very, very difficult to step back and say, hold on a minute, this just doesn't make a lot of sense. People have written books about this, about the misuse of the royal prerogative and stuff, and the way, where it gets really dodgy is where there is evidence of the royal family actually using its state powers, its powers as head of state, for their own self-aggrandizement and for to benefit themselves, either by exempting the royals from certain legislation, as is in the case with some aspects of environmental protection, or indeed in matters to do with taxation and finance, where They intervene not from a neutral perspective, but from a perspective of what's good for them. The UK claims to be a democratic country, but if you look at the three main institutions of government, we have an hereditary head of state based on accident of birth that no one can change or question. We have an upper chamber, a revising chamber, which has to sign off legislation and can initiate legislation, which is comprised of people who are elected by nobody at all, the House of Lords, and not accountable to anyone at all. It's changed over the last, the last 50 or the last 25 years. There's been a generational change, but I think the discussion on Scottish independence that we had in the early part of the 2010s, leading up to the referendum in 2014, I think that sort of turbocharged the change, really. I mean, the case for independence isn't necessarily a Republican case, but when you start arguing about Scotland becoming an independent country, other questions immediately arise, like, well, who would be the head of state in independent Scotland, and what would the relationship be to the existing monarchy, and would Scotland be a member of the Commonwealth, and therefore what would its relationship be to the monarchy there? So it was on the sidelines, and I think although, like I say, the Yes campaign wasn't explicitly a Republican campaign, I think the process of that debate made an awful lot of people think about the monarchy and question whether or not it does actually make sense and is a logical arrangement in a 21st century democracy, and indeed whether it's something that we would want to see replicated if we were starting a new state and a new democratic apparatus in Scotland as an independent self-governing country. I think they're over in Scotland, and I think they're over in large parts of England as well, to be honest. This is only going to go in one direction over the next few years and decades. And I don't know whether Charles is going to be the last unelected monarch or whether there'll be one more, but there ain't going to be that many more. Because it's wrong in principle. It is simply not right that people who live in a democratic country don't get to choose their own head of state. They ought to. They do in most places, and they ought to here. But it's also wrong in practice, in that it creates a very poor system of government. And the fact that the monarchy is hereditary actually means that it ends up being quite an uncritical servant to the government of the day, which may or may not reflect public opinion in the things that it's pursuing. The unelected monarch doesn't provide for any checks or balances at all. It just provides for the creation of this symbiotic relationship where, in return for the government of the day being uncritical and unquestioning to the royal family will be uncritical and unquestioning of the government in return. And that sucks.